Welcome to This Explainer. Today, we're diving into a genuinely fascinating concept, the actual mechanics of how ideas, trends, and behaviors spread out in the real world. We'll be looking at Malcolm Gladwell's groundbreaking premise from The Tipping Point. And the core idea here is absolutely powerful. Social phenomena spread exactly like biological viruses. Seriously, whether we're talking about a sudden surge in a product's popularity or a massive shift in public behavior, they are all highly contagious epidemics. So, to really wrap our heads around this, let's look at a bit of a mystery. Why on earth did the violent crime rate in New York City just completely nosedive in the 1990s, seemingly overnight? And strangely enough, what does it have to do with the totally inexplicable overnight explosion of hush puppies? You know, that retro, forgotten shoe brand that suddenly became the hottest fashion trend in Manhattan out of nowhere? Well, the answer is that both of these events are epidemics. They both hit a critical threshold, and they tipped. Okay, let's dive into this. We're going to use a highly structured five-part framework to really dissect the epidemiology of ideas. Anatomy of an epidemic, the law of the few, the stickiness factor, the power of context, the rule of 150, and finally, how to engineer your own epidemic. Part 1, Anatomy of an Epidemic. How little causes have incredibly big effects. Gladwell points out three fundamental characteristics of all epidemics. They possess contagious behavior, little causes have massive effects, and change happens in one sudden dramatic moment. To truly grasp that sudden change, we kind of have to look at geometric progression. Imagine a huge piece of paper. If you fold it over once, it gets a little thicker. Fold it again, thicker still. Now, if I asked you to fold that paper 50 times, how tall do you think that stack would be? A phone book? Maybe a refrigerator? The real answer is that 50 folds would create a stack of paper that reaches literally all the way to the sun. It's mind-blowing, right? This perfectly illustrates how our brains just struggle with exponential growth. We always expect steady progression, but epidemics, they explode out of nowhere. And that brings us to the core definition here, the tipping point. It's that magic moment of critical mass, the boiling point. It is the exact moment our folded paper suddenly shoots out into the stratosphere. But what actually causes an epidemic to reach this point? Well, that comes down to three distinct agents of change. Part 2, the law of the few, or the 80-20 principle. So, the first agent of change is the messenger. You've probably heard of the 80-20 principle, where 80% of the work is done by 20% of the participants. Well, in social epidemics, it's an even tinier fraction of exceptionally gifted people who do the vast majority of the work in spreading an idea. These rare individuals fall into three distinct archetypes: connectors, mavens, and salesmen. Without these specific people doing their thing, a word-of-mouth epidemic simply cannot tip. First up, let's look at the connectors. These folks are essentially the social glue. They have this extraordinary, almost unnatural knack for making acquaintances across vastly different social, cultural, and economic circles. Think of Paul Revere. His famous midnight ride successfully sparked the militia because he was a massive connector. He knew exactly whose doors to knock on. Connectors leverage their weak ties to bridge completely different worlds, acting as these incredible network hubs that broadcast ideas far and wide. But, connectors have to get their information from somewhere, right? Enter the mavens. Mavens are your information specialists and brokers. They accumulate massive amounts of knowledge about the marketplace. They're the price vigilantes who know exactly when a store is faking a sale. But crucially, they don't just hoard this data for themselves. They share it purely out of a pathological desire to solve other people's problems. They are the human databanks that actually provide the contagious message in the first place. And finally, we have the salesmen. Even if a maven has the facts and a connector is out there spreading them, some people are still going to be skeptical. That's where salesmen come in. They are the charismatic persuaders. They have powerful negotiation skills and use incredibly subtle, often totally nonverbal cues to convince the unconvinced. Studies actually show they utilize things like conversational microrhythms and these subtle headphone nods to build deep, instant rapport. They don't just share an idea with you, they make you genuinely want to agree with it. All right, part 3, the stickiness factor. Crafting an unforgettable message. And this brilliantly illustrates the shift from the messenger to the message itself. Because no matter how great your connectors and salesmen are, if the message just goes in one ear and out the other, you do not have an epidemic. It has to be unforgettable. Back in the late 1960s, television producer Joan Gans Cooney engineered an educational virus to combat illiteracy among preschoolers. Her delivery mechanism was television, and her engineered epidemic, that was Sesame Street. By extensively testing and tweaking exactly how ideas were presented, they discovered they could systematically make educational content incredibly sticky and memorable for young minds. But the evolution of stickiness didn't just stop there. Decades later, the creators of Blue's Clues wanted to make an even stickier show. Now, Sesame Street used a very fast-paced, manic magazine-style format with some adult humor mixed in there to keep parents watching. Blue's Clues took the exact opposite approach. It was deliberate, highly literal, and relentlessly repetitive. I mean, they would even air the exact same episode 5 days in a row. Why would they do that? Because this slower, repetitive narrative demanded direct vocal interaction from the kids. Cognitive testing actually showed that by stripping away all those clever distractions and forcing participation, Blue's Clues scored higher in cognitive retention. They found the ultimate recipe for stickiness.
Part 4. The power of context and why your environment absolutely matters.
So we've got the messenger and the message. But what about the environment itself? Well, human behavior is exquisitely sensitive to context. And this is probably best understood through the broken windows theory. The theory states that visible signs of disorder, like say a broken window left unrepaired, signal to the community that no one is in charge, which actually invites more serious crimes. According to Gladwell, this is the context that explains that miraculous drop in New York City crime we talked about earlier. By actively scrubbing graffiti from subway cars and arresting minor fare beaters, the city radically changed the environmental signals. They literally tipped a context from chaos to order. Now, to be completely fair, there is heavy debate around this specific example. While Gladwell points to environmental cues like broken windows as the main catalyst, economist Stephen Levitt in Freakonomics presents completely different counter-evidence. Levitt argues the crime drop was actually due to a massive increase in deployed police officers, combined with long-term demographic shifts, specifically a decrease in unwanted children stemming from the Roe v. Wade decision decades earlier. It's a fascinating debate, and it perfectly illustrates just how incredibly complex the context of an epidemic can actually be. Part 5. The Rule of 150, Looking at Cognitive Thresholds. So the crucial point here is that one of the most powerful environmental factors is actually the size of the group you're in. Evolutionary psychology points us to Dunbar's number, 150. That is the maximum number of individuals someone can have a genuinely social relationship with. Below 150, groups can operate smoothly on peer pressure and personal loyalties alone. But the second you get above 150, you suddenly need formal hierarchies, rules, and bureaucracy to keep things running. And this isn't just a theory. For centuries, the religious group known as the Hutterites have strictly followed this rule. The moment one of their agricultural colonies reaches 150 people, they just split it in two, because they know that beyond that number, the close-knit community fellowship completely disintegrates. And there's this brilliant modern example with the high-tech firm W.L. Gore Associates. You know, the makers of Gore-Tex. They use this exact same principle to engineer their entire company culture. They want the infectious, fast-paced peer pressure of a small startup, even though they're a billion-dollar company. So their solution? They physically limit their plants. They build a parking lot with exactly 150 spots. The moment they observe employees parking on the grass because the lot is full, they don't just build an extension, they go and build an entirely new plant nearby. By keeping every single building under that 150-person tipping point, they ensure that their highly sticky company culture and shared memory easily infects the entire group. Finally, Part 6. Engineering your own epidemic, bringing it all together. Man, we have covered a ton of ground today. We've seen how geometric progression creates wild, sudden change. We've met the mavens, we've engineered stickiness, and we've explored the power of the Rule of 150. The real beauty of the tipping point is that it completely reframes how we view change. It proves that massive, overwhelming problems don't always require massive, overwhelming solutions. Sometimes a tiny, perfectly targeted adjustment is literally all it takes. So look at your own life, your business, or your community. What small change will trigger your tipping point? Think on that. And if you enjoyed this explainer, make sure to subscribe to the channel, The Edge Library, to get notified of all our upcoming book summaries. Thanks so much for learning with me today.